great pleasure to welcome you to the Art History Seminar, part of the Arts Research Seminar Series, which is being held as part of the School of Culture and Communication and the Art History program here at the university. And we're really looking forward to hearing today Associate Professor Jill Carrick from Carleton University in Canada, who's joining us from across the oceans to speak about a topic she knows a great deal about, Daniel Spoerri. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. I'm just going to say a few words before we turn to Jill, and I'll just begin now by telling you that I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on today. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as well as the traditional owners of the land you may be on, and also acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today's event will have the following format. So I'll introduce Associate Professor Jill Carrick in a minute, after which Jill will speak for around 40-45 minutes. After that, there'll be an opportunity for questions. So if you have some questions, maybe note them down and feel free to talk them out at the end of the event, near the end of the event, or you can certainly enter them into the chat if you prefer to communicate that way. And that will be the conclusion of today's event. So now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce to you Associate Professor Jill Carrick. And Jill teaches art history and cultural theory at Carleton University in Canada, and she's in the Department of Art History, as well as the Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art and Culture. Now, Jill's research is primarily into neo-dada art in the 1960s in France and Europe, and she's focused particularly over the years on the pioneering work of artists such as Daniel Spoerri, about whom she'll be speaking today. It might interest you to know, those of you who are based at Melbourne, that Jill actually has a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's from the University of Melbourne, Australia. From little things, big things grow, right? And she also has a PhD from Bryn Mawr College in the USA. And among her many, many publications, an important monograph on the 1960s artist group called Nouveau Realism, which was published by Ashgate in 2010, and I noticed recently translated into French in 2018. Among Jill's many, many achievements, including many, many grants and institutional fellowships, she's known for her groundbreaking research, which has been published in really the top journals of record in art history in the world, including Art History, the Oxford Art Journal, and also a very important journal which will be known to some of you, called Antithesis, which is a journal published in the Old English department here at the university. And I remember very, very well reading Jill's article on fascinating fetishes about surrealism advertising and thinking, oh, gee, I wish I could do that. That was 1988. So here we are many, many years later. So that's a fantastic beginning and a wonderful continuation of an amazing career that Jill's had, with beginnings right here in Melbourne. So it really is a delight to bring my friend and colleague here to the University of Melbourne to share her research with you. And now I'm just going to pass over to Jill. Would you please begin? Thanks for coming.
Oh, Anthony, thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. I can't believe you can remember the Antithesis journal.
I've still got it.
There you go. Wonderful to remember all of that. And I'd also like to thank Tara Heffernan, and of course the University of Melbourne's School of Culture and Communication for inviting me to participate in this research seminar. I'm extremely excited to be here. And so thank you so much, all of you, in fact. So my paper today is based on a short text I very recently completed for inclusion in a book I've co-edited on the art of contemporary artist Daniel Spoerri. Now, as some of you may be aware, Daniel Spoerri is now a 90-year-old European artist who is well known for his participation in a 1960s neo-Dada group, an artist group called Nouveau Realisme or New Realism. Perhaps his best-known works are chance assemblages titled Trap Pictures or Snare Pictures, created in the early 60s. The anthology of scholarly essays I prepared with my co-editor in Paris, Dr. Deborah Lux, however, focuses on different aspects of Spoerri's oeuvre, namely his lesser-known work spanning over half a century of experiments in areas as diverse as artist books, food art, such as eat art banquets, as well as professorial and curatorial work. The book stems from an international conference we co-organised in collaboration with the German Institute for Art History in Paris, the DFK, that took place in 2018 in the Institute's Paris Centre over 2 days. And you're looking here at the front and back cover of the conference programme. The aim of the conference was to bring together scholars from around the world to present new scholarship on Daniel Spoerri in a multilingual setting. Our key interest was to investigate Spoerri's work within the context of his multiple artistic, intellectual, and personal networks. Given Spoerri's many addresses over the course of his life, he's variously lived in Switzerland, France, New York, Greece, Italy, Germany, and Austria. The theme of multiple exchanges and transfers across place and time figured prominently in the papers. Today, rather than present you with the paper I co-wrote for the book, I'd like to read you something more modest. Notes I've scripted that discuss the cover image of the book. The text is conceived as a type of companion piece, in fact, to the introductory chapter of the book. And so I begin. Daniel Spoerri's Seville Series number 6, Dessert Table, Heim berger, Anker dishes, was created in the Swiss village of Oebersdorf at the end of October 1991 and exhibited soon after in southern Spain at Expo 92 in Seville. Like many of Spoerri's so-called trap pictures, it consists of an actual tabletop, its contents glued down and the whole raised and hung vertically on a wall. The networks of exchange evoked in the title of this book privilege questions of topography, territory, and travel. And Spoerri's Spanish-Swiss dessert table offers unexpected vantage points on these themes. The details of this sculpture, which has received little scholarly attention, are frequently lost in standard photographs of the work. However, a closer examination of the piece reveals much about not only the individual work, but Spoerri's oeuvre as a whole, as well as the issues featured in the essays in this volume. Despite the seeming fixity of Seville Series number 6's upended meal, its petrified micro-territory of chance and communal exchange is anything but stationary. A quick survey of several presentations of Seville Series number 6 shows that Spoerri's topographies nimbly defy expectations. While the work is best known through photographs that present it facing in one direction, after opening its transportation box, surprised gallerists have found it equipped to be hung the other way. The work's internal components also refuse to stay put. A bowl of meringues, for example, positioned near the centre, is visibly less plentiful in the more recent on-site photograph on the right, aptly suggesting the friable foodstuff's tendency to disintegrate over time. While the physical topography of this sculptural relief is thus dynamic, markers of territory nonetheless abound. Red napkins adorned with the white cross of the Swiss flag advertise Swissness, while a business card bearing the name of a potter based in Kiezen, a village near Heimberg, signposts a specific region. Indeed, questions of territory lie at the heart of much of Spoerri's practice, as referenced in the artist's thought-provoking discussions of exile and displacement. Now, discussing both territory and tabletops, Spoerri has elaborated, and I quote him as follows. A table is a meeting of different types of things, and it isn't such a directed order. It's a question of territory. Because I had lost my territory since childhood, and even during childhood, I never had a territory. As I said before, I was a Romanian Jew, evangelical in an Orthodox country, whose father was dead, without being certain he was really dead. I swear to you, the first things I glued down were all that feeling, unquote. For Spoerri, then, the trap pictures testify to a fundamental lack or loss of territory. Yet Spoerri's paradoxical strategy of staking claims while unmooring physical coordinates of space and place also thrives on rich, entangled experiences of encounter and exchange. As outlined in our introduction, the present book traces interconnections in Spoerri's oeuvre across time and place by identifying 4 guiding themes or red threads. These threads, which we identify as sentimental attachment, anecdote, art life encounters, and humour, come to the fore in Seville Series number 6. Its details suggest the importance of interpersonal networks and collaboration in Spoerri's art. So let's turn to the first theme. Seville Series number 6, its subtitles shed light on various sentimental geographies and bonds of attachment commemorated in the work. One extended title reads, The Seville Series number 6 Dessert Table, Heimberger Anker Dishes, eaten by guests of Edith Tellman and the ceramicist of the dishes. Ties of friendship, in fact, link Spoerri with Edith Tellman and her late husband, artist Paul Tellman, whose art explored optical effects caused by motion and colour. Now, Edith Tellman hosted the meal in the village of Oebersdorf, welcoming guests such as the local potter, Hans Steiner, whose traditional circular patterned tableware is featured on the tabletop. In a decentering gesture typical of the artist, the title of the image emphasises the involvement of the participants. Now, for Spoerri, the site where Seville Series number 6 was made also holds sentimental value. Although little discussed in the existing literature on Spoerri's work, the artist resided in Oebersdorf next to the Tallmans for 5 years when he was not teaching in Munich at the Academy of Fine Arts. His residence in a schoolhouse originally run by nuns besides the Tallmans' 16th century home, the latter once known as Schloss Englisberg, is perhaps one of Spoerri's lesser known territories. And here, in fact, we're actually looking at the Schloss Englisberg and the schoolhouse over here. Exuberant, sentimental imagery bordering on kitsch is on full display in Seville Series number 6, which doubles as a tongue-in-cheek ode to Switzerland. The trap picture has snared not only Swiss flag paper napkins, but also, if we look here, for example, horn-handled knives and the uncoiled metal mainspring of a watch. In addition, 2 printed napkins prominently display the image of an alpenhorn, up here, for example, a long carved musical instrument historically used by shepherds to communicate in the Alps. Each of the tabletop objects are situated on a traditional lace tablecloth decorated with net and web-like patterns. A wide band of interlaced threads punctuates the tablecloth surface and forms a central axis that comes into view when examined from the side, but fades somewhat into the background when viewed from the front. So you can see that going right across the piece here. Spoerri's multi-layered topography interweaves traditional crafts with elements of mass-produced popular culture, mixing different triggers of sentimental affect. This then is the playful work that Spoerri, who holds a Swiss passport, sent with other Seville Series reliefs to decorate the walls of the Swiss Pavilion restaurant at Expo 92. And now I'd like to switch to anecdote. Spoerri has provided anecdotal accounts of the conception and construction of his 1992 Seville Series. His stories whisk the reader from Switzerland to Paris, Italy, and finally Spain, where they chronicle various vicissitudes and perilous events that occurred during the installation of the exhibition. Vignettes include the near destruction of the reliefs by drunken, super Swiss precision workers, to use Daniel Spoerri's humorous description of the poor Swiss pavilion staff during a pre-exhibition dinner. Another Spoerri story recounts how he broke his arm while preparing for the installation. While the anecdotes clearly foreground the roll of the dice nature of chance, a different text by Spoerri, printed on the Swiss Pavilion restaurant's menu, offers a more theoretical account of his intentions. Three of his reflections deserve particular attention, namely his labelling of his works as memento mori, object photographs, and miniature theatre pieces fixed in time. Spoerri's choice of vocabulary sharpens our understanding of the track pictures as both material records of the past and performance traces. His description of the works as vanitas reminders of the, and I quote him, the final and ultimate fixation, death, unquote, however, also targets modern culture and consumerism. As the menu puts it, and I quote, thus in my snare pictures, I'll start that quote again. Thus, my snare pictures are memento mori reflections on the vanity of our ongoing struggle to survive in the mechanized, aseptic, rationalized, and hygienic consumer society today, unquote. Now, might this pithy message, read by diners seated in the midst of Switzerland's hypermodern Expo 92 pavilion, have offered further food for thought? We are left to imagine the diners seated amidst dozens of trap pictures hanging from the walls of the restaurant, perhaps even feasting on Swiss cheese below Seville Series works, including, as you can see here, number 32, number 27, and number 1, complete with the skeleton of a tapir as a centerpiece. So I come now to the third theme, art-life encounters. In positioning his works in the Swiss Pavilion restaurant, Spoerri once again staged a richly layered conceptual encounter between art and life. As he explains in his text on the menu, and I quote, I have long wanted to juxtapose these relics of survival with life in progress. Finally, in this eaten-by restaurant in Seville, I am able to do so, unquote. And the text concludes with the words, quote, although eaten by means nothing more than eaten by you and me, the actors and observers in this ever-changing, ever-repeating act of life are in fact ourselves, for we are all seated at one and the same table, unquote. Now I turn now to the final theme of humour. Spoerri's art frequently intermeshes art and life with humour. Seville Series number 6 is in fact crammed with art history jokes. The name Anker, for example, in the title, references Albert Anker, a painter who lived between 1831 and 1910, who is known for both his genre scenes of traditional Swiss village life and his still lives. Now, the latter include works such as Stilllebentee und Schmelzbrötchen of 1897, which, like Spoerri's still life, presents the viewer with a cup and saucer, milk jug, and sweet pastries on a white decorated tablecloth. Anker produced a number of similarly themed works, as you can see from the example on the left. Spoerri's trap pictures are themselves a sophisticated interrogation of the art historical genre of the still life, here turned on its head through the use of black humour and abject material remains. Now, although Philip Morris cigarettes here have replaced the typical pipe, and Hans Steiner's business card, here, if you can see my arrow, have replaced his image here of a tiny pot, in fact, stands in for older mise en abîme devices. The traditional vocabulary of the European still life, stretching from 17th century Dutch genre painting to 19th century paintings by Anker, is still clearly discernible. 20th century avant-garde art is also slyly referenced in Seville Series number 6. Its white crosses, red triangle, trapezoidal forms and circles on a white ground easily evoke the suprematist motives of Malevich, an artist of long-standing interest to Spoerri. And to remind you of his visual language, I'm showing you Malevich's 1920s mystic suprematism, red cross and black circle here. As I've mentioned actually in another publication, Spoerri has noted, and I quote him, in the 1950s in Bern, I was passionate about the writings of Malevich and Moholy Nagy. Since there were no paperbacks then, I recopied with a typewriter Malevich's book, The Non-Objective World, unquote. So there's a long-standing interest here in the abstract language of the European avant-garde in Spoerri's art. And if we keep looking at this visual vocabulary that Spoerri has, in a sense, restaged here furthermore, the circular ornaments on the plates may also evoke Spoerri's personal network of artistic exchange. In 1964, Paul Tallman, the artist whose house Spoerri later lived next to, contributed a kinetic work to Spoerri's Édition Mat, Multiplication d'Art Transformable series that consists of a black and white bicolored ping pong balls on a reversible black or white ground. If we view Tallman and Spoerri's work together, we can see that the Édition Mat work visually rhymes with the white polka dots on the black milk jug and other light on dark, dark on light motifs in Seville Series number 6. So what we're looking at, just to expand on this a bit more, is Paul Tallman's Object of 1964, which in fact formed part of a series of multiples that Daniel Spoerri organised, where he invited many artists, some very famous, others not famous at all, to basically create a work of art that would cost very little and that could be created in multiple editions so that people could actually afford to buy themselves a work of art. In fact, Anthony and I plan to actually write together on the Édition Mat series or some aspects of it. So, so this may be a bit of a foretaste of some of our scholarship. Notice too, in looking at this work, we're looking at two sides of the same multiple sculpture. The sculpture can be switched over and displayed on one side or the other, in other words. So I photographed the two examples of the work hanging side by side here to give you a sense. The idea, of course, is that the balls are movable so that you can rearrange your movable work of art as you wish. Now, in 2014 then, Spoerri created another multiple, a multiple from his Seville Series number 6 itself, called Der Alpenbläser, Albert Anker Tisch, or the Alphorn player, Albert Anker table, which you can see then before you. Like Paul Talman's Edition Mat contribution, it is both a limited edition multiple and an optical game. The piece consists of a three-dimensional cardboard construction based on a photographic print of the Seville relief, this time, however, equipped with hooks to hang vertically. Now, although slightly miniaturized, the toy-like reproduction accurately captures the colours of the original, including the green vegetal details that embellish the circular discs and the hues of the plates with their varied cream, pink, dark blue and black grounds. The topography of the work, however, has undergone some curious transformations. Cut-out images of plates, saucers, knives and spoons now hover above the surface of the tabletop, some raised by small pieces of foam, others in fact glued to the frame's sheet of glass. The relief's built-up layers of superimposed images create several surprising optical effects. Viewed from the side, or while the spectator is in motion, the vertical multiplication of flat forms can produce the effect of a slight blurring of contours, somewhat comparable to that of a misaligned print registration. Challenging our eye, while affectionately poking fun at techniques of multiplication, Spoerri's trapped territory once again appears to have shifted. Now, as discussed in our introduction, the present book looks beyond Spoerri's trap pictures. While Spoerri cannot be reduced to these works, a detailed re-examination of his best-known artistic strategy can nevertheless provide new insights into the artist's broader concerns highlighted in this volume. Seville Series number 6 helps us explore Spoerri's fluid, transitory, overlapping territories, while sensitizing us to the complex relations of enmeshment and exchange at the heart of his oeuvre. And with that, that is actually the end of the paper. How's that?
Great. Thank you so much, Jill. That was fantastic. That was really interesting. So that's just a really stimulating paper, and there's a lot to take in there. I don't know how familiar people are with Spoerri's work. Even I'm quite familiar with it. I had no idea that he had done particularly this multiple thing. So this is the opportunity now for everybody to comment, to ask for clarification, ask a question of Jill. So I'm going to just go straight to questions now. So everybody please fire away and we'll try to monitor the questions as they come in. Mark.
Thank you, Jill, for that wonderful talk. I'm not familiar with Daniel Spoerri's work, and this was really enlightening, and it's very interesting to kind of get this introduction through this work. I was curious about particularly another element within the work, and that of narrative, and what elements are going on there. Because one thing, I mean, the one thing that I noticed is kind of an ex-smoker. Is the cigarettes kind of caught my attention as a whole. And this has been an issue that I've had a lot with teaching students, is that since smoking has gone down in number, explaining kind of the social habits invested with smoking and kind of the implications of certain things have become increasingly difficult to kind of explain to the younger generation, which is a good thing as a whole. But it's interesting to kind of see that shift. But in this case, I mean, the cigarettes I focus on, but there are many other elements as well. But I mean, the cigarettes in particular, I mean, is there anything behind kind of is there anything in there? Because I mean, the positioning of it is very awkward. There's a cigarette sticking out, the brand of the cigarette, the number of cigarettes versus the number of the plates. Is there more that you can say about a kind of a narrative? I mean, you don't have to focus just on the cigarettes, but.
Yes. So, so with the work itself, quite often Daniel Spoerri actually narrates little stories to go with his works when you ask him, and he's actually published many stories about certain of these trap pictures, including one called The Anecdote and Topography of Chance. With this work, though, there's very little reference to it, and I contacted Daniel Spoerri a couple of weeks ago to see if he wanted to elaborate on aspects, and as he said, perfect right. He didn't, he didn't really add very much. He told me a little bit more about let's see, the village where he lived of Überstorf, and basically told me that he had no idea it was called whatever it was, Schloss berger, or whatever. But he hasn't. But really, the references in his writing and there's very little he's actually said about this. So in other words, I guess in answer to your question, we're actually left in some ways with it's kind of cool to reconstruct stories ourselves, and there again, Spoerri would use the term anecdote. He'd encourage us, I think, to spin our own anecdotes, our own stories, just as you did, around the work. But he also definitely has been interested in other types of, if you like, reading or talking about these works. So, for example, in one of the other texts, actually, in the anthology, an author looks at links between his works and the writings of Claude Levi-Strauss, right? So, so he's interested in anthropology as well. So that said, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but I'd be very interested in hearing more actually from you, if you like, on actually, notions of narrative and how they might be helpful in decoding these kind of works.
Well, I mean, in this case, I mean, this is very, very, I mean, just a superficial reading. I mean, I'd like to link it to something kind of more lofty or ideas, but I mean, just in reading the table and so forth and kind of focusing on the cigarettes, I mean, it seems like there's there's only two smokers at the table, and one of them has been smoking a lot, and I mean, that suggests kind of power hierarchies, because it's kind of, I don't know, it depends on when it's made, because nowadays if somebody's smoking at a table, it's kind of less acceptable, but I mean, you could get into kind of these different interpretations, but there's a lot of fodder here for discussion and kind of argument about what is going on, which, I mean, makes it a remarkable work just for that alone. I mean,
thanks for that question, Mark. That's provoked some interesting discussion. Would anyone else like to put their hand up or send us a message through the chat about a question?
There are a few questions that are in chat.
Okay. Do you want to read that out?
Mara, thank you so much, Jill. Could you speak more about horizontality? I wondered if that was significant for scant-garde art. I think that's avant-garde art.
Yes, horizontality. Okay, this is interesting because in trying to think about this work, and in fact, I'm just going to shift it. Shift the screen so I can actually look at it a little bit as I discuss it. If that's okay. I guess I took it for granted that one of the key games with Spoerri's trap pictures is that he usually takes a horizontal surface and shifts it to the vertical, and that is this kind of strange kind of optical lesson that he's interested in provoking for us to basically shift our expectations. So, typical data kind of act in a sense. But when I was thinking about this, I actually got caught up in something else. Actually, rather than the shift from the horizontal to the vertical, I spent ridiculous amounts of time trying to figure out whether this thing could actually be displayed just in one direction, or whether it could actually be shifted around. And I became convinced alas, because I was wrong, I became convinced that it could be displayed from any angle. Why? Because I had seen this work once, and I took photos of it, and so I could see my own photos that displayed one way. But every photograph that I found in reproductions of it in various books or catalogues pictured it in other wild directions. Like you name it. It was on its side. It was upside down. It was whatever. And so I started, I spent too much time thinking about this work as something that was completely mobile in a sense. So there was a different kind of shift of perspective, if you like, I thought was going on in this work. And of course, I only found out very recently, like about a week and a half ago, after corresponding with a gallery director in Germany who's just opened a show that includes this work. I wrote to him and asked, how does this thing sit? How is it displayed? And he basically said, look, there's only one way of displaying it. The hooks are on one side. It hangs this way. So the opposite way, in fact, from how it's pretty much nearly always been displayed, except when, so that threw out my theory and my little argument that I developed about mobility in that regard.
Perhaps we should move on to Belinda's question, if that's okay.
Great, please go ahead, Tara, you're in charge.
Belinda says, thank you for a fascinating paper, Jill. I'm not familiar with Spoerri's work. I was interested in instability in the work, especially when it is turned on end. It reminded me of the instability of Cézanne's tablecloth still lifes, sorry. The instability seems even more marked in the later iteration with the overlapping cutout. Is that visual uncertainty / anxiety a feature?
Great question.
Yes, it is. That's terrific, and I love the way you tie that in with Cézanne, and of course, that Cézanne language is in a sense also playing with a tradition of earlier painting, right? The Dutch 17th century genre painting, yet again with those unstable knives, etc., or platters that are hanging over the edge of a tablecloth, of a painted tablecloth. So the viewer is, of course, in some ways put or made ill at ease. So yes, that instability is definitely there, and there's even it's funny. Spoerri does have anecdotes too about the danger of some of his works. I mean, he's very careful; these things are very carefully glued on, right? But he does have an anecdote himself about a work that I think used to sit above his bed when he was a much younger artist. And something fell off at some stage, and I think it seemed to be a bit of a warning to him that glue really did need to work. But that said, perceptually, I guess, or at least when we as viewers look at one of his trap pictures, I think there is a sense a slight sense of danger and unease that things could very easily appear as though they could easily fall because they are defying gravity. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jill. I mean, it really speaks also to his playful kind of sense of humour that's evident in the work as well.
Yeah, doesn't it? And it is, I love that sense of play. I mean, all too often people focus on the kind of, I think the, like the gallows humour, the black humour in his work, which is there as well. But a lot of his work is just downright playful, full stop. It's quite joyful. There's an almost childlike freshness in terms of his, of curiosity and the kind of humour that comes across.
Yeah.
So
I think out of remove, it looks very that kind of like a sanitized, what we'd expect of a still life, and then you look closer and there's all of that kind of mess in the middle of it. It's great. Thank you.
That's right. No. Well, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up. Thank you, Jill, for a great paper. I wanted to follow up on what Belinda's question was referring to, which is this idea of the uncertainty or anxiety, but how that might relate to chance, and whether the the question of the adhesive and how that medium is used in the snares comes up in your research, and how you sort of figure that in relation to the sort of the more visible objects on display. And also, for me, it's always struck me that the snare has a kind of photographic aspect to it because of the way in which it's like a snapshot of, you know, a sort of moment, maybe a domestic scene. And in that sense, it makes me think of more contemporary artists, maybe contemporaries of Spoerri's, or even more, you know, acolytes in some way. Thomas de Man, for example, his photography practice, which is about, you know, photographing an installation and then destroying that installation with only the photograph remaining. Yeah, maybe if that makes sense to comment further on this idea of the adhesive.
Yes, I wish I could give you a technical answer to that, actually. There are people who, I think there's a conservator who's worked, and I think is planning to publish something on the actual glue and the other techniques for fixing the work. Let me continue just with the technical side of this for a moment, right? Because I do know something just about that aspect. It isn't just glue, or put it this way, with a lot of the, for example, the plates, etc., in many of these trap pictures, Spoerri has mentioned that he creates kind of, he digs, or technically, I hope I don't misrepresent him here, but he apparently creates kind of little funnels so that the glue embeds itself in channels into the actual board that is supporting these works. In other words, he's stabilizing these works, even though we can't see it. At other times, I've noticed when just looking, I can see, you know, other things like in one early work, there was this kind of a staple or some kind of metal clearly holding something in place. But generally, I think he's just developed some pretty sophisticated, actually, ways of using glue to really make these things pretty solid. But that's just, you know, the technical, well, you know, one small technical aspect. Coming back, I'm really thinking out loud here, you know, this notion of uncertainty, its relationship to chance, to the photographic flash or capture of a moment in time. You know, in his writings, right, he yeah, I'm just no, I need to think, I really need to think more about that. Actually, I mean, certainly Spoerri's spoken about these works in some ways as a kind of a snapshot in time, as I mentioned, right, in the essay, that captures a kind of setting of evidence. And he's talked about this even in terms of criminal, of detective fiction, right, like Sherlock Holmes, etc. So these things are here as clues captured at a sudden moment, a shocking moment in time, which of course we can go and read in relation to theories of shock and particularly trauma, which I've actually done in the past in relation to these works. So through a psychoanalytic lens, there's a lot to be said about that, I think, and a lot more to be said about that. But yeah, where am I going with this? That is a whole other area that I can, if you like, I can visit a little bit, although that hasn't been, I must say, as I say, that hasn't been foremost in my mind writing about this particular work, but that aspect of a traumatic shock, a freezing of a moment in time that then gets repeated and repeated, and that is I think I've used the term traumatic realism, actually, in a sense, to evoke this particular process. And in that case, we can tie it right back, of course, to his biography, etc.
Right. Yeah, of course. So Yeah, the sort of forensic nature of or a forensic reading of the work is kind of how you can link, say, photography in like the sense of like a crime scene almost to the way in which the work is kind of captured as well. It's quite interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great.
Exactly. And sorry, just to elaborate too on this notion of crime scene, he's done some really interesting works with photographs, blown up photographs with superimposed objects called criminal investigations, which are very confronting works. I don't know if I'll ever end up writing on those because I actually find them too hard to deal with in many ways. But they're giant photographs. It's been a long time since I've seen them, but at least I think almost a metre high, etc., of photographs from a manual for, I think it was, police in Germany who were taking shots of crime scenes of basically murder and or suicide victims. And so he took that horrific material, Spoerri took that horrific material, blew it up to proportions that are just very confronting, and then, if you like, collided that imagery with just one or two objects that he felt spoke or created further narratives, if you like. So he, yeah. There's a lot that could be done, I think, going in that direction if you want to.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much, Jill. That's really informative. I'm really especially interested in your third point on the art and life encounters. How effective would you say his work is in sort of eliminating the distance between art and everyday, the mundane life? Thank you.
Right, thank you. Yeah, great question. It depends if we talk, I think, about these kind of works, which in some ways we could view as relics, right, of a situation, or whether we want to talk actually about the situations themselves, which are obviously different in a sense, but Spoerri's practice does include lots of really pretty fascinating eating performance pieces, where he stages banquets in collaboration again with a lot of people, sometimes cooking schools, etc. As some of you may be aware, you can still go and attend these banquets, right? I went to one myself quite a few years ago now, where basically you come in, you're positioned at a table, and the food art arrives. And in the case of the banquet that I was in, the meal did go backwards. It was a palindrome dinner, as he calls it, where basically the meal started backwards, but then proceeded to the beginning of a traditional meal, except that of course everything was trempe, right? So the food all looked different from what you actually tasted. So it was pretty fun, and in that case, that's really lived experience. That's where it's certainly not mundane, right? Because you mentioned the word mundane. It's not mundane. It's a very non-mundane situation to find yourself in, but it's still a situation where art and life are kind of corporeally really mixed together, right? So quite a bit of his food art, or as he calls it, eat art, shifts around those kinds of themes. Also within a sociological context, I should say, and that's again, things like the dinner for the rich and the poor, right, where he staged a dinner where apparently people got positioned at different tables, and the rich had a lovely table setting and wonderful food, or wonderful looking food. The poor were given just very simple food to eat. And I can elaborate on that if you're interested. So there's a whole lot of themed banquets or themed food pieces that he's done. But I don't know. Yeah, again, the coming together of art and life. I think the restaurant situation at the Seville exhibition is a really interesting example, which again I'd like to kind of think about and develop more. As I say, that I finished this pretty recently, but I'd love to have a sense of the experience of the diners who were there. You know, did they even notice that stuff? I presume they did. Yeah. So
interesting. May I ask a question? I know we're a little bit over time, but I've just got a quick one. If that's, I can just impose upon you a bit. You might have anticipated this question. The kind of cuckoo clock aspect, right? So, you know, Switzerland is notorious, right, for its, you know, the Bischofberger still do those advertisements where they have, you know, the the kind of like folk Swiss
the carnival
parades
imagery.
and the shepherds with the horn and the, you know, basically if there wasn't a cuckoo clock there, you know, everything else. But I guess I'm interested in that because not just sort of thematically, but I think at a deeper level, what I perceive, you know, there are different attitudes to kitsch. You know, one attitude to kitsch is parodic, let's have a laugh at something which is dead, you know, it's in the past, it's so 5 minutes ago, you know, whatever. And then there's another relationship to kitsch, I think, where you use the word sentiment, you know, where these markers of what, you know, I'm sure Spoerri is well aware, would be viewed in that fashion as some kind of hopelessly, you know, redundant or almost pathetic, you know, cultural references actually have a really deep emotional resonance for him and for other people, and are connected to living social relations and are not to be kind of looked down upon in a way. So my question is, what I, you know, sense is that dialectic between the kind of fixed and the frozen, and then the sort of mobile network and interrelational aspect of the work. And does kitsch fit into that model?
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's several ways of looking at his interest in objects, kitsch and otherwise, and one is in terms of his own personal or sentimental attachment, if you like. But the other is almost, I wouldn't say as a voyeur, but as someone from outside looking in on other people's objects of attachment.
So it's both, in other words, to go back to my original question.
Yeah,
that's really
both.
Interesting.
Yeah. How we read that, I don't know. I mean, I think more generally, perhaps Spoerri is fascinated in, I guess, what I'd probably call fetish objects, right? So objects with kind of heightened powers of fascination, or even objects that are ascribed with powers of some kind, be it sentimental value or value of other kinds. So his work goes right across the whole horizon, right from sometimes looking at religious imagery, sometimes looking at this other kind of giant vocabulary of kitsch, kitsch imagery associated with place and culture, etc. And he even has works looking at sexual fetish objects. You know, it goes on, and he uses money, destroyed money, interestingly, in some of his works as well. Shred is against the law, depending on the kind of currency, right? And
interesting.
Yeah. But yeah. So Anthony, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, if you have any insights, as you do, I know, kitsch, please go ahead.
Well, no, I just think you know, the trap of his trap works is to be trapped into the thing of thinking that, you know, there's some kind of deeply skeptical attitude to life or art or anything really in culture, and that in fact there's something much more invested and mobile and fluid that's happening. And you know, it's interesting to compare this. I don't know if we have time to think about this, but I don't know if you've ever thought about this work in relation to relational aesthetics. It's almost like a kitsch question now.
Well, it is, but that's all right. Yeah. Well, the thing is, you know, with relational aesthetics and the theories of Bourriot and others, you know, Spoerri's work was of interest to people like Bourriaud through the mediation of Pierre Restany, who was one of the critics who promoted Nouveau Realiste art, right? So there's, I think, in some ways, a fairly direct link.
Between Restany and Bourriaud?
Aesthetics work, really.
Do you see there's a lineage there, or is it Bourriaud is interested in the lineage and kind of looking backwards for inspiration?
Well, as I understand it, and again, you know, I hope I'm not incorrect here, but Bourriaud knew Pierre Restany, the critic, very well, apparently.
Wow.
Therefore, and I'm just trying to think of Bourriaud's text whether he actually mentions Spoerri. I don't think he does, but I can't remember now, and I haven't read everything he's written anyway. But certainly, you know, he through Restany could not help but be completely aware of Spoerri's works and food artworks. You know, the restaurants, the galleries converted into restaurants where Chef Daniel would actually cook and then serve food to the gallery visitors, and you know, etc. All of that is, I think, certainly in France, those works are quite well known.
Well, sometimes when I look at these trap pictures, I always think, you know, there's the fun time that all the art world bigwigs are having that I was excluded from. You know, this is I get a seat at the table, you know, in a way, like, of this history. So anyway, that's just my kind of inferiority complex speaking, perhaps. Feel the conscious now of the time. So I think I might have to just formally thank everybody for coming. And also, Jill, it was incredibly generous of you to offer your time to us today like this. And I know, you know, it's a crazy time for everybody, but, and it's, you know, I'm not quite as fresh at 5 p.m. as I am at 9 a.m. So even more, you know, you deserve even more accolades as a result of that. But, you know, it's been great to have you here today and to continue your long association with, particularly with University of Melbourne, and also with like the long tradition of research and writing about post-war European art. And thank to everybody for coming along today. And I guess we might just conclude matters there, if that's okay for everybody.